So, fun fact, everybody, I have zero clue what to discuss today. But I also know myself well enough to know once I start talking about something, I'll probably figure it out. So, welcome to this week's coaching call. Let's get rolling. Um, okay, I actually have a good place to start. There was um, where did I put it? It must have been over here. There is Yes, excellent. There is an article newly released by NPR.org. It came out yesterday, and it is specifically about how essentially you cannot out-exercise a bad diet by evidence. And I have not read the article in full depth. I also have brought up the study that was cited um, as evidentiary of you can't outrun a bad diet. Um, and I have not read entirely through that, partly because I have not had a whole bunch of time to do so. This is an article that only came out yesterday. Um, but I wanted to hit on a couple of points that the NPR article actually does a really good job in stating. Um, I will, if I can remember to, I will put a link to that article in the comments on this video. Um, but essentially, there are a few major points that the NPR article states in respect to the study and its conclusions. Now, sorry, my lips were just feeling dry. Um, One of the things to keep in consideration whenever you see an article in a magazine and a newspaper or whatever publication, and it is citing a study as reference for what's being stated within the article itself, it's always worthwhile to check where the study was published and whether it is a peer-reviewed study. Peer-reviewed essentially gives you um, a better likelihood of it being a study that is um, one, more reliable, and that it's a reputable source of information because of the evaluation process that's involved in peer-reviewed work. Um, this that process involves experts who are taking a look at this study and they're in the same field of work in which this study is investigating. And they're looking at the quality of the study, its validity, and the originality of the research, as in, can the um, can the study be essentially like new knowledge, new perspective, building upon previous or challenging previous information within a specific field. So this is about the study having been able to produce something novel and informative and valuable to the body of research about a specific subject. So, therefore, contributing to the advancement of knowledge for that subject. A peer-reviewed study that moves on to publication has done these things well enough. Um, Oftentimes, one of the indicators of a peer-reviewed study is a study that actually lists the ways in which it can be improved upon or the limitations that were presented within the research itself, as in how it was that the study was conducted can be improved on. A study that's not acknowledging those things potentially was not peer reviewed and also potentially is not appearing in a in a magazine, a scientific magazine of good reputation. Um, so I did a little bit of digging on the publication in which the study was published, uh, essentially to see where they received their funding. Because, to put it politely, you need to follow the money when it comes to reliability. Industries that have a whole lot of money oftentimes will fund studies that will lead to conclusions in the money's best interest, which is why things like dairy products get brought up in research so very often, because you have a very substantial industry for dairy within the United States that's going to put money towards studies that will back dairy as a healthful ingredient in someone's daily diet. They're not going to fund studies that could potentially show that dairy is inflammatory for some people or for many people, as the case could be. That's just an example. Because you also have studies out there showing this kind of information that dairy is inflammatory for certain people. And those studies aren't being funded by the dairy industry. So it's always worth looking at where the money is coming from. What I was able to find, and also something to keep in mind is studies don't necessarily have a very quick turnaround to get to publication. So you oftentimes don't see the dates in which a particular bit of research or data was collected. You have the publication date. The publication date of the study in question, let's see, it was received in October of 2024, October 10th, 2024. That means that essentially this was one when um, the let's see. So this study was conducted at a university. Um, was it? Hold on. 65 total author, no, 68 total authors on the study. Um, you actually get clickables for the information on the authors. Do, 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 do. It is an open access article, which is always good. You want as many of the articles as possible that that could be come across to be accessible to the public. Um, Obviously there are certain publications that will have some open um, open access articles and others that aren't. Um, a lot of times when you get articles that are not open access, it's because um, they're in publications that are generally subscription and for research for like doctors, other medical professionals, um, different industry, professionals who would subscribe to have access to this kind of information. Um, so let's see. So just that is a lot of authors for the article. Um, so the article itself was edited by someone at PSL University in Paris. It was received on October 10th, 2024 for review. And then that review was accepted on March 31st, 2025, um, by a specific editorial board member. Um, it was published July 14th, 2025 in PNAS. Um, I'm not sure whether to call it a journal or, um, yes, we're going to call it a journal. They call themselves a journal. The Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a peer-reviewed journal of the National Academy of Sciences, NAS, which is specific to the United States of America. So, big reason, even with them saying it's a peer-reviewed journal, big reason I did the research to see who funds the research that goes into the articles in this journal. Um, well, big reason I looked at who funds the journal was just to make sure the journal itself was not going to, even as a peer-reviewed journal, be swayed by the money. Um, the journal does not receive funding from the federal government or from the academy, as in the NAS, National Academy of Sciences. Um, PNS is prohibited from retaining a surplus or maintaining cash reserves. Technically, this is a good thing. Okay. So, what it ultimately means is that as far as scientific research goes, the article in question is a reliable resource. So, again, I will look at the article itself later. I'm keeping it up on my computer to do so. And I will be um, I will be just right here going through again some of the major points from the NPR article about this study. So, the biggest thing is that the study calls into question a very, very common explanation that as societies have developed, they've become more sedentary, people have gotten less active, and that the assumption is that cause and effect, as a result, we're burning fewer calories each day, contributing to an energy imbalance that'll lead to weight gain and over time, obesity. This study compared daily total calorie burn for people from 34 different countries and cultures around the world And they ran the spectrum of activity levels. So you had still the hunter-gatherers and farming populations with lower rates of obesity to people in more sedentary jobs in places like Europe and the United States, where obesity is much more common. And again, because we see these two different populations, the normal assumption has been higher energy expenditures among hunter-gatherers and farmers or farming populations worldwide, and sedentary individuals in developed countries. The key piece of the key pieces of data collected in this study seem to indicate that the total calories burned per day among these different populations, again, hunter-gatherers on one end of the spectrum, sedentary individuals on the other, and every activity level in between. When you when the study accounted for specific specific factors so that the real information that you're looking at is the energy expenditure. It wasn't different across populations. So total calories burned per day was seen as very similar across these different populations, even though the lifestyle and activity levels were really different. It suggests that diet and not a lack of physical activity is the major driver for weight gain and obesity in developed countries. As a result, it anec it at least anecdotally combats our assumptions um, that physical activity factors drive a lot of weight gain and obesity in today's world. So again, 34 different countries and cultures represented, 4,200 adult men and women were studied. Um, Essentially, they were given water that contained isotopes that would come out in their urine, and those isotopes were used to determine how much energy that each person was expending, and not just in their active movement, like planned exercise, but also the energy it just takes to survive, keeping our hearts going, keeping our brains working, and the rest of our nervous systems, things like that. So they, when adjusting for things like body size, people from populations that have higher obesity rates were really only a little bit less total energy per day than people who weighed less. And essentially, what the NPR article is stating there. And again, this is one reason why I'm going to go and read the article, the study itself at some point in the near future. What the author of this NPR article is suggesting is that there was no statistically significant difference in the amount of calories burned between those who are obese and those who aren't. So the, let's see, the name mentioned in the article, Okay. So Herman Pontzer is a professor of evolutionary biology and global health at Duke University, and he studies how human metabolism has evolved. Um, Past research of his appears to be supported by the conclusions they were drawing in this study. Um, his past research has suggested that our bodies tend to adjust how we expend energy to keep our daily caloric burn stable within a fairly narrow range. So, if we burn more of our energy every day on physical activity and exercise, after a time, our bodies adjust and spend less energy on other tasks. So we sort of don't notice that going on in the background, which honestly, that is actually true. The harder you exercise, the less likely you are to go and move differently throughout the day. That's seen time and time again in um, in caloric deficit situations, so fat loss situations. Um, it is a reason why training harder isn't the answer sometimes because the recovery factor has to be there. And and I'm so glad that this was pointed out. Our bodies are built to adapt to the stimulus being presented. So essentially, these new findings have a significant implication for obesity. If differences in calorie burn can't explain why some countries have higher obesity rates than others, it's got to be something else. And the um, as the article in NPR suggests, diet would be that question. So, or that answer. So, if that's the case, then what is it about the diet? And NPR expands to say in this article that um, other recent research suggests that food is the biggest driver in obesity, that our food in developed countries is now dominated by our food supply in developed countries is now dominated by ultra processed food, which we know is produced, manufactured in a way to be highly tasty. So the likelihood of us eating more of it is higher, which means, of course, we'd be buying more of it. Um, and the biggest thing, there are so many other factors, honestly, around food. Things like socioeconomic status, um, the availability of whole foods in different cities, towns, areas. There's enough to take a look at on the food side of the equation and how it is that our bodies work with food is a really big question. Exercise, while the mechanics of how it works for our bodies is highly um, intricate. I would say that the nutrition side of the equation is equally or even more intricate. And another thing I am really, really glad that the NPR article finished with saying is that this doesn't mean there's no reason to exercise. It's good for our mental and physical health in so many different ways. Um, but reiterating its title, it doesn't mean that we can exercise our way out of an unhealthy diet. So the suggestion made by the study's authors is that if we want to tackle the problem of obesity, then the public health message should really focus on changing what's on our plates. And I want to express again that that question needs to include a whole lot more factors than just simply telling people, eat this, not that, or eat more of this and less of that. Again, in part because of things like what's available where. That is the one of the biggest factors. Large cities, you can absolutely find good food. And by good food here, I am actually meaning healthier substitutions for different things. Now, yes, you can also find a whole bunch of the ultra processed foods, and I am never going to say that we should never have ultra processed foods. What I am going to say is that if you are looking at improving your health in general, then you really can't go wrong with even just gradually incorporating more whole foods in your diet while simultaneously reducing the presence of ultra processed foods. I'm going to end there for today because I'm surprised I actually went that far on that article. But please feel free to ask questions. Again, if I remember to do so, I'm going to link that article, both the NPR and, if you really want it, the study itself, because it is open access. And if you're reading through the study, you can always let me know if you've got some questions about the way it's worded. Study reading is not for the faint of heart. I will put that out there. It is a challenging thing to do, but I also believe well worth it if you can practice with it enough to understand the jargon, the terminology that gets used. Um, Study reading is also a very dry thing for any of you who are not interested in a dry read. Like I said, come back at me with questions, and I will talk to you all later.